Okay, so imagine this. You're a black farmer in Kentucky back in 1897, and you've built a good life for yourself and your family. You own your own land, you're working hard, and then in the middle of winter, the Ku Klux Klan shows up at your door.
Yeah, it's a story that really brings to light the just the horrific racism in the South after the Civil War,
Yeah.
just how far people would go to hold on to power and control.
And that's the story of George Denning.
Right. And what's so incredible about his story is that he didn't just endure this injustice, he fought back.
And that's what we're diving into today in this deep dive. We're going to be looking at an episode of the My Favorite Murder podcast, which tells George Denning's story. And it's a story that will stick with you.
Yeah, and for a lot of our listeners who are, in their late 40s to early 60s, this might seem like ancient history, something you read about in a textbook, but George Denning's story makes the realities of Jim Crow like so real.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about legally enforced discrimination, the constant threat of violence,
Yeah,
just a system that was built to work against Black Americans.
absolutely. And yet George Denning was able to build a successful life for himself.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. He was born into slavery, got his freedom around age 10, and ended up owning 125 acres of land.
That's incredible.
Yeah, it's just incredible.
It really shows his resilience.
Yeah.
His unbelievable work ethic and his pure determination to create a better life for himself and his family.
Right. But his success wasn't celebrated by everyone.
No, unfortunately not.
Yeah.
There was a lot of resentment, especially from some in the white community.
Yeah, and the podcast does such a good job of like painting a picture of that night when the Klan attacked Denning's home. I mean, we're talking 25 men showing up in the middle of the night, accusing him of theft with no evidence, and then resorting to violence. It's just terrifying to imagine what he and his family must have gone through.
And, the host really emphasized how Denning was totally caught off guard. He was forced to defend himself and his family. I mean, he even got shot in the arm during the shootout. So it was a very real, very dangerous situation.
Yeah, and tragically, a white man named Jody Kahn was killed during the chaos. And, in 1897 Kentucky, a black man killing a white man, that was basically a death sentence.
Absolutely. And the media really spun it that way, too.
Oh, yeah.
The podcast shares some newspaper articles from the time, and it's just shocking how biased the coverage was. They painted the mob as the victims, completely ignoring the fact that they were the aggressors. They were the ones who trespassed onto Denning's property and started the violence.
It's scary to think what could have happened to Denning if it weren't for Sheriff Bud Clark. He really went above and beyond, defying expectations and helping Denning escape what would have almost definitely been a lynching.
It makes you wonder, though, how many other stories like this are out there that we don't know about. How many times has the narrative been controlled by those in power and the voices of the victims have just been silenced?
And even though Denning did escape with his life, the price he and his family paid was just devastating. I mean, their home was burned down, their farm was destroyed, all their possessions were lost. They had to flee in the middle of winter with practically nothing. It's hard to imagine that level of despair and fear.
It's truly heartbreaking, but even in that moment of complete devastation, Denning did something pretty amazing. He wrote a letter to Governor Bradley asking for help and just eloquently laying out all the injustices he'd face.
And thankfully, Governor Bradley listened. He made sure Denning got a fair trial. He even sent in a militia to protect Denning from any potential mob violence.
Yeah, the podcast describes the atmosphere at the trial as incredibly tense with the militia there the whole time, just to ensure Denning's safety. But it's interesting because even a white-owned newspaper at the time acknowledged that Denning had acted in self-defense. It was a small glimmer of hope in a system that was so often stacked against Black Americans.
But despite that, the jury still convicted Denning of manslaughter, which to me just feels like a blatant miscarriage of justice.
Yeah, it really shows the limitations of the legal system, even when they're willing to acknowledge self-defense. You have to remember that the whole legal framework was often built with racial biases, making true justice really hard to achieve for Black Americans.
It is true that Governor Bradley did pardon Denning soon after the conviction,
He did.
but that didn't give him back what he'd lost. It didn't erase the trauma or make up for everything that had been taken from him.
No, it didn't, and this is where we see the strength of George Denning's character. He could have just tried to rebuild his life and move on, but he chose to fight back.
Yeah, he decided to sue the mob, which is just an incredibly bold move for a black man in 1897.
It really is.
I mean, can you imagine the courage that he was basically making himself a target again? And unfortunately, the podcast does mention that he was attacked and beaten pretty badly for speaking out.
Yeah, it really shows how committed he was to justice, not just for himself, but for all Black Americans who were facing this kind of oppression. But to take on a white mob in court, he needed a lawyer. And not just any lawyer. He needed someone who was willing to stand up for what was right in a system that was totally against his client.
And that's where Bennett H. Young comes in. He's such a fascinating and kind of complicated figure. I have to admit, when I first heard he was a Confederate veteran, I was really surprised. How could someone who fought to keep slavery become a champion for a Black man who's facing racial terror?
It's definitely a contradiction, and it makes you think about his motivations and his beliefs. But My Favorite Murder episode really emphasizes that while his past is definitely problematic, you can't ignore what he did. In this case, he represented George Denning pro bono, which means free of charge. And from what I understand, he put everything he had into getting justice for his client.
It really makes you think about how people can change. They can learn from their past and choose to do what's right, even if it means going against the very system that they used to support.
Absolutely. And it's a good reminder that people are complicated. They can have different beliefs at different times in their lives. But going back to the trial, the podcast actually quotes part of Young's closing argument, and it is powerful.
Yeah.
He speaks directly to the jury and asks them to really see the brutality that was done to George Denning and his family. And then he asks this really intense question: is God dead?
I got chills when I heard that. It just cuts to the core of the moral issue. It forces the jury to confront just how awful the mob's actions were. And you have to remember, this is an all-white jury in 1899 Kentucky. For them to side with George Denning, it's pretty amazing.
It really shows how good Young's arguments were.
Wow.
He was able to connect with the jury on an emotional level and make them see the injustice even in a system that was built to favor white people.
And then there's the financial side of the verdict. The jury awarded George Denning $50,000 in damages, which is like over $1 million today. It's a big statement. There are consequences for this kind of racist violence.
Yeah, it's a really important detail because it shows that this wasn't just about condemning racism. It was about real accountability. Of course, like the podcast points out, actually getting that money was a bit more complicated.
Right, because a lot of the mob members, they didn't have any money. So while George Denning didn't get the full amount, it was still a huge win for him, both symbolically and financially.
And it's interesting how this case, even though it was so important, kind of disappeared for a while. It wasn't until like the 2010s that historians and journalists rediscovered it and realized how groundbreaking it was. I mean, a major legal battle against racial injustice.
It really makes you wonder how many other stories of Black resilience and resistance are out there just waiting to be found. How much more would we know about our history if we could uncover all those stories?
It's a good reminder that we still have so much to learn and discover, but
Yeah.
thankfully people are working hard to bring stories like George Denning's back into the light, and that helps us understand the past better, and it inspires us in the present.
And as we move into the final part of George Denning's story, I think it's important to shift our focus from the legal fight to something bigger. The idea of generational resilience. How did his courage and his determination impact his descendants? How did his fight for justice shape the lives of the people who came after him?
That's where the real impact of this story is. It's not just about winning in court, it's about how courage can inspire people for generations.
And that's where George Denning's great-grandson Anthony Denning comes in. The My Favorite Murder episode talks about how he feels about his ancestors' legacy. And it's really powerful. He says he inherited that fighting spirit, that determination to face challenges no matter how hard they seem.
It's a really great example of how family history can shape us, how the people who came before us can influence our values and beliefs. And even what we do, it shows how connected we are to our ancestors and their struggles.
It makes you think about your own family, doesn't it? Like, what stories of strength and resilience have been passed down in your family? Are there any hidden stories waiting to be discovered? Stories of courage that could inspire us today.
Yeah, it's like we should all go explore our own family histories. Talk to our relatives and try to piece together those bits and pieces of the past and see how they've shaped who we are.
And that's what's so cool about these deep dives.
Yeah.
It's not just about learning history. It's about sparking that curiosity and encouraging us to connect with the past and see how it affects our lives now.
If we really think about what George Denning's story means, it's clear that it's about the fight for racial justice that's still going on. His win in court was a huge step against a system that was designed to hurt Black Americans.
Right. It showed that change is possible, that even when things seem impossible, one person can make a difference. But it also reminds us that the fight isn't over. The racism that George Denning faced back in 1897, it's still around today in different ways.
Yeah, his story makes us think about those injustices and use our voices and our actions to push for equality for everyone. It's like a call to action. It's telling us to be resilient and determined like he was, and to work towards making our communities better.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into George Denning's amazing life, we want to leave you with something to think about. If a man who was once a slave could overcome so much and win against a system that tried to keep him down, what could we achieve today if we all had that same resilience and determination to fight injustice?
That's a powerful question, and it's one that we should all think about and, more importantly, act on. Georgia Jennings' story shows us that we're not just watching history happen, we're part of creating it. And who knows, maybe if we explore our own family stories, we'll find even more inspiration to keep fighting for a world that's fairer and more just for everyone.
So keep learning, keep asking questions, and never forget that one person's story can really change the world.